So, okay, so assuming all of these wait TCP listening calls have returned, they must all now be ready and listening. So what's next?
So after that, looks like we're going to do a FTPD dot reload certificate manager.
Yeah,
So
what's that? Don't care.
okay,
Something to do with the certificates, isn't it?
right?
I guess it's like saying, hey, reload your certificates just in case something changed on disk, which it did because we just wrote a bunch of cert files and
Yep,
things.
yep.
And then there's this comment, isn't there? What does that say?
Uh, it's no lint colon error check.
Yeah, any idea what this is about? Have you seen this before?
I haven't seen it before.
So there's a thing called golint, which is not the only golinter, but it's the original one. Um, and what does a linter do? Is it sort of looks through your code for common potential mistakes, isn't it? It's like saying, it's not that there's errors in your Go syntax. The compiler will tell you that vociferously and repeatedly. And, if the program compiles successfully, it could still be wrong, of course. And there are lots of common mistakes that people could make. One such mistake would be if a function returns some error value, not receiving it and checking it, isn't it?
Sure, sure.
That's probably what's happening here, because if that's the case, then if you run golint, or the de facto canonical linter now is staticcheck, which is excellent. Does pretty much everything that golint used to do. And it will presumably pick up if this is happening. It says, hey, you just called reload certificate manager without receiving any result. But in fact, it returns some result. Indeed, it returns an error result. So you probably meant to look at that because there could be some error, and if there is, there's almost certainly something wrong that you need to take care of. So the linter would complain every time, wouldn't it?
Yep.
And, programmers could react to that kind of thing in different ways. They might react by saying, looks like I need to check some error here, in which case they would do that and then the linter would stop complaining. Or they might say, no, I don't want to do that, but I also don't want the linter to keep complaining, so I'm going to add a special comment, or pragma. In fact, this would be a linter pragma, wouldn't it? It's a specially formatted comment that's meaningful to the linter, and it says, no lint, so in other words, don't complain about this. Specifically, don't complain about the fact that I haven't checked the error.
Got it.
Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
it's not reasonable. You shouldn't do this.
Right,
You should just fix the error, or not run the linter. Either
right.
way,
Yeah,
But this seems like the worst of all worlds, doesn't it? It's like you have the annoyance of dealing with the linter, and you're going to ignore what it says anyway. That's not a good world to be in, is it? Should we check? Does that function in fact return
sure.
error? Yeah, it does.
Yep. Sure.
So this is clearly wrong, isn't it? Why would you have that function return error if you're going to ignore it? Just call it reload certificate manager YOLO. We hope that this will work, but that's basically the extent of our strategy.
Got it.
And I do see this a lot, and people complain endlessly about error handling in Go, and they say, oh, there's all these functions that return errors, and apparently I have to check them all, and this is Go's fault. Why is Go making me check all these errors? And I just think, yes, I see your point of view, but on the other hand, these errors can really happen, can't they? I mean, if you try to open some file on disk, it might not be there. The disk might not be there. Or the file might be there, but you can't read it because you don't have permission. Or halfway through reading it, somebody might unplug the disk and then it stops reading. I mean, those are real things that can happen, aren't they? What are you going to do in that situation?
Right.
Just carry on. I mean, pretty soon you're going to crash or panic because you're assuming data is valid and it's not. So is that really how you want to program? Doesn't appeal to me. So if these errors can happen, then what choice do we have? You know, we sort of have to look for them, don't we, and take some action. The alternative, I suppose, would be exceptions, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
You know, you could think of exceptions as being the errors are still there, but they're implicit in that if you don't receive and check them, they'll sort of bubble up to the person who called you, and then if they don't check them, they'll bubble up further, and ultimately, at some point, if they bubble all the way up to the top level of the program, it will just crash, and the user will see a nasty error message, you know, unhandled exception, something, something, something. That's not a good UI. So you probably want to write some code which catches that exception, isn't it? This paradigm is sometimes called try-catch, because you're like, try some section of code which can throw an exception, and then catch what? File not found exception, you know, no permission exception, something like this. But I would argue, and I appreciate you're not arguing against this, but I'm just saying, I would argue, where is the right place to write that code? Is it right where you're opening the file, or is it miles away in some completely unrelated part of the code base, many levels above where that gets called? I mean, what could you do in that situation? Not a lot, right?
Right.
It may actually be that some errors are survivable, isn't it? Or at least retryable. Or you could print a message and say, sorry, it doesn't look like that file's there. Would you like to try another one? You know, the only place you can do that is right there where you're actually getting the error. By the time the function's returned, it's way too late. It's really awkward to do retries and so on in this situation. So I think, and I don't know whether you agree with this, maybe the psychology at work here is just basically saying, you know, I assume that any runtime error that can happen is just something I can't do anything about. It's just automatically fatal, isn't it? So all we're going to do is exit the program anyway. So why not just panic, right? Why check the error?
Sure, sure. I guess it's, yeah, and we're in that main section as well, so maybe the thinking is that, yeah, it's all or nothing.
Yeah, and I'm not criticizing the author of this project specifically or not uniquely, but it's more like I don't think it's people deliberately setting out to write bad programs or to use languages with bad error handling paradigms. I think it's just that maybe their imagination has not encompassed the idea that some errors can actually be successfully handled. Because if they can't, then there's no need to do any handling whatsoever, is there? If you can't handle things, why bother? But you can, sometimes. Having said that, 99% of my Go code is if not equals nil, exit. But, you know, at least the possibility is there.
Right.
So that's fun. So, yeah, I think if you absolutely force me to summarize my advice about this, which clearly you do, I would say don't use these no-lint pragmas. Either fix the problem or don't run the linter or configure the linter not to pick up that particular problem. The worst thing of all, incidentally, would be to deliberately write really awkward code just so that it makes the linter happy.
Sure, yeah.
That's terrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
And you do see this. An example is, you know, some things return errors which we genuinely don't care about or can't do anything about, like printing. You know, thumped println returns error. Who knew? All the thumped functions return error, in fact. And of course, it's reasonable that you might not be able to print for some reason. You know, your output could be going to a file and you can't write the file or something. So there can be an error, but what would you do? You know, print some message? Well, you already know you can't print. So it's a bit of a losing proposition, isn't it? You know, if you try to log something and you get an error from logging, what can you do? Log it? Not really. So in practice, we always ignore errors from thumped and things like that, unless you know, it really is important. If you're writing user data to disk or something, and in fact you couldn't write it, that's desperately serious, isn't it?
Yeah.
If we didn't handle that situation, the user would lose data and not know it. I mean, maybe you lost the data and there's nothing you can do, but it's still important to say, sorry, I lost all your data. You
Sure.
know, at least then you know. It's like if you know you lost your credit card, you can at least cancel it. But if you don't know you lost it, you're in big trouble. So sometimes you'll see people write things like, just to pacify the linter, they'll say, you know, error equals funced printer, then something. If error is not equal to nil, then nothing, you know, return error or something. And that really is useless error handling. I mean, if you just saw that, then I would have some sympathy with your criticisms of Go for being too verbose with errors. So, you know, so how should we summarize this? The summary of the summary is run a linter, but don't, you know, it's a linter is a servant, not a master, you know. It's to remind us about stuff that could be mistakes, but if they aren't mistakes, just ignore those. Don't write awkward code just to make the linter happy, and don't use these no-lint directives. I think that's a mistake. Fine. I'll probably extract that out into a whole episode on linting and error handling. Let's return to the one about the FTP server.
Okay.
So what happens next?
So next is line 375, FTPD conf. We're going to set that to config.get FTPD config.
Mm-hmm.
And then we're moving on to FTPD conf.bindings, and we're going to set that to a slice FTPD.binding, and it's taking port 2124 and TLS mode of 2.
Yeah, so we're still configuring.
Yes.
It seems.
Yeah.
I feel like we should try and... I think we're sort of getting close to our time, but I think we can finish this test main, can't we? Because we must be getting close to the end of it. So it's set up, and yada, yada, yada. We're starting all these servers, waiting for them to start, configuring them, writing their certificates, and all of this stuff. And then we have another gofunc, and it's initializing that FTP server again. Or didn't we already do that? Or is this another one?
It seems like it's, yeah.
We had those 3 servers already, and now here's
Correct.
another FTP server with a different config on a different port. Yep. TLS mode 2. Okay, maybe that's, you know, FTP over TLS, something like this. So all of that set up, wait TCP listening again until that one has started. Then there's this function called wait no connections, isn't there?
Yep.
Any guesses about that?
I think it's just going to be waiting using that sort of for loop construct that we talked about earlier. And it's just trying to see if, I guess, everything's up and running.
Yeah, wait no connections implies it's going to wait until there is no connections, isn't it? Or am I reading that wrong? Why would it care about that? I'm not sure. Let's take a look. Okay, just read us through this. It's fairly short.
Yeah. So first, the function wait no connections using the time package, time.Sleep 50 times time.millisecond, and then there's a for loop for len common.connections.get status greater than 0, and then time.Sleep 50 times time.millisecond.
Okay, so it's like, first of all, sleep 50 milliseconds, then call common connections, get stats. We can guess that's just like how many connections do you have right now, isn't it? And the fact that it's common, that's maybe this is explaining what that common package is about, in that this applies to all of the servers, we could guess. Isn't it? You could have said, hey, FTP server, how many connections do you have? HTTP server, how about you? and so forth. But I guess the fact that they use this common thing means we can call something like common connection get stats, and if it's not 0, then just keep sleeping and trying again forever, isn't it?
Yeah.
Presumably, I mean, why does it matter if there are existing connections to those servers? Maybe it doesn't, or maybe just to make the tests easier to think about, they want to ensure that, you know, why would there be any connections? Who would be connecting to them? Well, the answer is we would, isn't it?
Right.
It's those wait TCP listening functions which are relentlessly trying to connect, and failing and trying again. And I guess, you know, having succeeded, they will succeed one time, won't they?
Yeah.
And then once they've succeeded, they'll just throw that connection away or close it and throw it away. And we need to wait for that to happen, I guess. So we don't need to. The server can accept multiple connections, I suppose, but I guess they just want to have a clear playing field, don't they? To just say, wait until those test connections have closed. Now we can start the real thing. Okay, let's go back.
Okay.
And here it is, isn't it? We said there must be an m.run at some point. And here it is. So what does m.run do? It does what would have happened if you had no TestMain function. So we said there's some implicit main, which just runs all your tests and reports the results. If you write an explicit main, as we have here, then, you know, there's no automatic main, so it doesn't automatically run your tests. You have to explicitly run them. How do you do that? m.run is the answer. Apparently, it returns an exit code, which is, I guess, just like, you know, usual binary exit status, isn't it? 0 means everything's fine. Something non-zero means something went wrong. I don't know what the semantics are for GoTest apart from 0 and non-zero. You know, I don't know if it's just 1 or if there can be other values that indicate different things, different types of failure. We don't care, because all we're going to do with that is just call OS exit, isn't it?
Yep.
But before that, what happens?
So before that, it looks like there's some cleanup going on using the os.remove.
Yeah, OS remove everything.
Yes.
All of these files and paths and certificates and stuff that we set up. This is where we could really have used t.TempDir, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
Because if we'd written them all there, they would automatically be cleaned up anyway.
Right, right.
Which would be great. But that t.TempDir is pretty recent, by the way. I think that came in last year or something, so this probably predates that. Fine, so we clean up all that stuff, and then we exit, so that's the tests done, isn't it? So we have used a lot of time, but we can take a lightning glance at one of these actual tests, can't we? Just because it would be nice to see one, having endured all of that setup. You patiently and clearly read all of that code. We'd like to see what it's all for, wouldn't we? So test initialization failure doesn't sound promising. Can we find another one that's a bit... Oh, test basic FTP handling. That sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Should we have a quick look?